Welcome to the Loma University Church, Church at Study, or our Sabbath School time. Today represents the last segment of Pastor Randy's special presentation on how to study the Scriptures. This is part one. Next week will be part two, and we'll be announcing shortly our brand new Sabbath School broadcast, but we hope you're blessed by today's presentation.
Welcome again. We come to the Gospel of John. I want to just quickly set the stage by reminding us the sayings that we have been going back to and talking about with reference to what the different Gospels emphasize. First of all, you'll remember that Matthew tells us what Jesus taught. The discourses are very important in Matthew's Gospel. Mark tells us what Jesus wrought, the activity, the action, immediately, always on the move. That's Mark. Luke tells us who Jesus sought. And you saw that last week as we talked about the different people, those who had been pushed to the margins, those who were not, I suppose if we used a different context or culture, we would say those who were untouchable. Jesus was very interested in drawing them in to the circle of the kingdom of God. And then tonight we come to the Gospel of John. John tells us what Jesus thought. You really see the heart, the mind of Jesus in this Gospel. He opens it up in some unique and some powerful ways. That will become evident as we look at different pieces of John's Gospel this evening. It will become clear that Jesus and his relationship to the Father are front and center in John's Gospel. In fact, he uses the word Father in referring to his Heavenly Father over 100 times in this Gospel. So as you can see, it is something that is constantly on his mind. It's what he's thinking about. And because it's what he's thinking about, it becomes what he is talking about. As we've mentioned several times in this series, John's Gospel is unique. We'll say a little bit more about that in just a little bit, but just be aware of that by way of setting the stage. Now, from the SDA Bible Commentary, a quote, John is not so much a sermon reporter like Matthew, or a biographer like Mark, or a historian like Luke. He is preeminently a theologian whose inspired insight led him to set Jesus Christ forth as the incarnate Son of God. He's a theologian, but deceptively so, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. The reason I say deceptively so is that, as we'll see again tonight, when you read his gospel, you're struck by its simplicity until you linger over it and suddenly are struck by its depth. So there's a certain sense in which you think it's very simple, but then as you ponder it, you realize that the depth of the theology of John is truly stunning. Growing out of that quote, we might say that Matthew might be compared to a reporter, like a religion reporter in a newspaper. Mark might be compared to a biographer, Luke to a historian, and John, as it said, to a theologian. Now, I want to say at least three things, spend a few moments on this, talking about John's uniqueness. So we begin with this one. The Gospel of John is significantly different than the Synoptic Gospels, because much of John's material is unique to his gospel. That's one of the uniquenesses. You may remember this if you've been with us through the 5 weeks. You may remember this slide from our first evening. A slide that gave a comparison of what is unique in each gospel and what is shared in each gospel. Mark, you see, has very little that is unique to his own gospel. Much of Mark is shared primarily by Matthew and Luke. But when you come down to John, you find that exactly reverses itself. That the largest part of John is unique, and that there is a much smaller portion that is shared with the other Gospels. So you are getting a very unique look into the heart and the mind of Jesus as you study the Gospel of John. So that's one way in which John is unique. Much of his material is unique to his Gospel. A second uniqueness to John. This is not intended to say that he is the only one that does this. It is intended to say that he is the one that does it with the greatest clarity. In other words, you see this all through his gospel, and that is that he uses simple language to express deep theology. So just think about this. You're familiar with these words. These are the words of John's opening prologue. The likelihood is that if you grew up going to Sabbath school or maybe grew up going to Sunday school, the likelihood is that you memorized this somewhere along the way, that this was a memory verse. Part of the reason you memorized it was its utter simplicity. But I want to take just a couple of moments to notice what is actually contained in this prologue by way of theology. So first of all, we read it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all people. You've read that. Have some of you memorized that or part of it along the way? Just see, well, look at that. Most hands go up, absolutely. It's a very common part of John's gospel, a recognizable part of his scripture. But let's look at it more closely. You could argue that not a single theological term is contained in that prologue. It's all simple language. In the beginning was the Word. It doesn't get much more simple than that. The Word was with God, the Word was God. Simple language. But then you pause and linger over the words and start to realize, wow, the affirmations, the theological affirmations made here are profound indeed. The pre-existence of Christ is there. In the beginning was the Word. So already we're into something that was a very important facet of the early church's understanding of Jesus Christ, that He was pre-existent. That is part of what makes Jesus who Jesus is. So that is there. There's an introduction to the Trinity. And the Word was with God. Suddenly you realize, well, there's more to this than just Jesus. There is a widening circle. It has, in fact, if we were to follow it, it has some allusions back to Genesis 1. And the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. And God saying, let us make man in our image, etc. So you have some simple language, but you are introduced to the concept of the Trinity. The divinity of Christ. This was contested in significant ways in early church history, not with the early church as in the Acts church, but within the first 2 to 3 centuries of Christian history. This was greatly contested, whether or not Jesus was actually divine. John just says it very simply, and the Word was God. It doesn't take a theologian to understand the simplicity of that statement, but a theologian could spend years plumbing the depths of that statement. And the Word was God, the divinity of Christ. What about Christ as creator? Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. There are some similar kinds of feelings to Paul's statement in the first chapter of Colossians to this particular statement, but a very important facet of understanding Jesus. And finally, Jesus Christ as the source of divine light for all people. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all people. Now that's just to take it at its most obvious and simple. One brief paragraph from the Gospel of John, and we are already into deep theological waters. The pre-existence of Christ, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, Jesus is creator, Jesus is the source of light for all people. It's an amazing statement that, as I said earlier, in the best sense of the word, is deceptively simple till you linger over it and begin to plumb its depths. Now, a few verses later, another theological theme is added. Often when people memorize that first introductory paragraph, they memorize this statement 12 or 14 verses later along with it. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. With those simple words, we are introduced to the incarnation of Christ. So deep and rich theology right off the bat. Now you're probably aware of this, but just in case you're not, an interesting sidelight on this particular verse. Some of your versions may make this clear, although you have to basically coin a word in English to get to this, where it says the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. The literal translation of that would be that He tabernacled among us. It is a direct reference back to the children of Israel coming out of Egypt in those portions of the second half of Exodus where they are given very clear and, if you remember, detailed instructions on how to construct the tabernacle. And then finally, when it is finished, when it is complete, that the presence of God descends there at the tabernacle, and suddenly, surrounded by the tents of the camp of Israel, there is God dwelling in their midst. Well, John uses that kind of a word. He tabernacled among us. Some render it, He tented among us. He pitched His tent right in the middle of our camp. Or to use Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, says He moved in next door. So that's the reality of the incarnation of Christ. I love John's simple, direct, easy to understand wording to get at profoundly deep and important concepts. So that's part of John's uniqueness. Disarmingly simple language, astonishingly deep concepts. Now, part of this is that John writes on at least two levels. In reading his gospel, be conscious of the fact that is what is happening on the surface, the most obvious level, the level of the story and the unfolding events, is legitimate and meaningful, and often points to what is happening at a deeper and more substantive level. This is more true of John than it is of any other gospel. I mentioned this once before, but I want to come back to it and underline it. You remember this incident, John 13, where in the Last Supper section, John, it's the Passover. They're celebrating the Passover, which by the end of the evening will have become the Lord's Supper. And it's that moment that comes in the meal when Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." Now, if you put together the picture that emerges from what John says about that evening, it's really quite stunning. It moves me. Because if you piece together what John says and paint in your mind, as it were, a portrait of the scene, what you end up with is this. They would have been reclining around a low table. They wouldn't have been sitting like we do here this evening or sitting like you did to eat supper. It would have been a low table. They reclined typically on their left side, and they reclined into the chest of the person immediately to their left. And then their feet stuck out from that circle, or what was sometimes a U shape as well, like spokes on a bicycle wheel, and a servant could come make his or her way around the outside, washing their feet and not disturb what was going on. Well, as they reclined there, the picture that emerges is that John, the disciple, the beloved, is reclining into Jesus. He's immediately to the right hand of Jesus, which was considered to be a place of honor right next to the host. But the one into whom Jesus was reclining, which was considered to be the place of highest honor, was none other than Judas. So here Judas is at the place of highest honor. Jesus is still working to reach him. When that moment comes, when Peter motions to John and says, "Ask him who it is," John apparently reclines into Jesus and says, "Lord, who is it? Who is the one that will do this?" I've often thought, had I been in Jesus' place, here you are in an intimate setting, it's a bit awkward, and John is asking this, and he said, "Who is the one?" I would have been tempted just to go, Jesus doesn't do that. He tears off a piece of the sop, dips it in the cup, and says, "It is the one to whom I will give this sop after I have dipped it," and he gives it to Judas. There are scholars who believe, accurately I think, that is an act straight out of the culture of the day by which an honored friend was recognized in a public setting. It would have a similarity to our day and time. If you were to go to a wedding with a friend, you don't know the couple, you're visiting a friend, "Come on, go with me." "I don't want to go, I don't know anybody." "Come on, I don't want to go alone." So finally you go with them. Sit through the wedding, sit through the reception. At the reception, a young man and a young woman get up and they offer a toast. You don't know who these people are, but by that very simple act, you make the correct assumption. Well, that's her best friend, and that's his best friend. Because by that act, you know they are the best man and the maid of honor. And by that act and giving the toast, that must mean these are the ones to whom those two who are getting married are the closest. It's a simple social act that makes a statement about the relationship. What Jesus did was apparently the very same kind of thing. He gives it to Judas, apparently says something to Judas that is somewhat veiled, or maybe at too low a volume to be heard. Because it leaves the other disciples saying, once Judas left, what did he do? Where did he go? I don't know. Maybe he went to buy something for the feast. They're confused as to what's happening, which indicates Jesus must still be trying to protect Judas. Gives it to him. In essence saying, Judas, I know what's on your mind. I know what's in your heart. Before you go do this, just know that my final thoughts of you are thoughts of love and friendship. It is at that moment that this verse comes. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and what? And it was night. It's one of many examples in John's gospel where he means that it was night, but that's not really what he means. It's night, all right, but it's a deeper night than just that night out there. Ellen White picks up on this theme. Notice this statement from Desire of Ages. In surprise and confusion at the exposure of his purpose, Judas rose hastily to leave the room. Then Jesus said unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. He then, having received the sop, went out immediately, and it was night. Listen to this sentence. Night it was to the traitor as he turned away from Christ into the outer darkness. So just one example of John writing at two levels. The obvious, the clear, the simple, the deep, meaningful, theological. So that's a second example of John's uniqueness. But a third example of John's uniqueness is John begins with simple incidents and then moves, almost without warning, into long discourses. If you read John this week, you were reminded of that. Such occasions typically begin with some action by Jesus and then change almost imperceptibly into an extended presentation by Jesus on a theme related to the action. Now, this happens a number of times. Let me just point out some of the times when this happens. It happens with Nicodemus. Starts with the story of this encounter in the garden, starts with Jesus and Nicodemus talking in ways that are understandable, but at the same time a little bit vague, and you're trying to sort out exactly what's going on here. You realize that it is a conversation about real life. Nicodemus is still struggling with what's to be taken literally, what's to be taken symbolically. You must be born again. Well, how can a man be born? I'm an old man. I'm supposed to enter my mother's womb, be born again? And Jesus, no, Nicodemus. Don't take everything I say so literally. And then he goes on and continues to explain the way of life. As you continue reading John 3, and this is made evident by some of your versions that are red letter editions, and if they're not red letter, then just watch for the quotation marks. There is disagreement as to when the actual discourse from Jesus ends and where John begins commentary, inspired commentary, on the incident. In fact, some of your versions will end it with John 3:15, so that John 3:16 is the beginning of John's commentary on what Jesus and Nicodemus have talked about. Others will include it within the quotation marks or the red letter, so that it's part of what Jesus said. The bottom line is, sometimes it's hard to tell. When does the story end and the lesson, the discourse, the moral begin? Same thing is true with the woman at the well. You have a story. You don't have as long a discourse in this case, but it is nevertheless there. The healing at the pool of Bethesda, very same thing. The feeding of the 5,000 is a stellar example of this. In this particular instance, Jesus goes from working this miracle into a lengthy discourse on the bread of life. And it is a discourse that ends up with what becomes essentially the Last Supper theology in John's Gospel. He doesn't have, if you go to the last night before the crucifixion, you have the washing of the feet, you have conversation about the meal. You don't have the same wording the synoptics do about the specifics of breaking, giving thanks and breaking bread and distributing and so forth. You do have it here. In fact, this is the place where Jesus ends up talking about his bread, his body being bread and his blood being drink, and those who truly follow him will eat and drink his flesh. And by the time he's done, everybody's scattering. Everybody's leaving. They're saying, man, I can't take this. That's a tough sermon. And they walk away to the point where Jesus looks at his disciples and says, so, are you leaving too? And the disciples, in this almost plaintive statement, they say, Lord, to whom do we go? You have the words of life. In other words, we're staying with you. But you almost get the sense that even the disciples are kind of scratching their heads over this one. Well, it's an excellent example of an action that then blends into a discourse that is an important teaching moment. Same thing with the healing of the man born blind. This one kind of starts with a theological question. Who sinned, this man or his parents? Then you have the action, then you have the sermon. Very characteristic of John's Gospels. Some of the most significant insights in the entire Bible into the mind of Jesus and the heart of God come in those stories as Jesus lives out, acts out, and then talks about exactly what he's trying to communicate about the heart of God. We're seeing what Jesus is thinking. In a sense, this is almost like standing at the side of a surgeon as she performs a delicate surgery, but you have the privilege to stand there and have her talk you through it, explain it to you as she goes. Or it's like sitting at the desk of a great scholar who is doing scholarship on a text, and you have the ability to hear the work as it goes. You have that opportunity in John's Gospel with Jesus. As he does the work of God, then he goes about talking about what he's doing in that work, so we get a deeper insight into his mind and into the heart of God. So that's the uniqueness of John. Now, that's not all the uniqueness, but it gives us at least 3 insights into what's unique in his gospel. Now, let's talk a little bit about the structure. You remember last week when we outlined Luke, there were 6 sections that you can pretty clearly see in Luke's gospel as being the structure or the outline of his gospel. You could do something similar with Matthew, something similar with Mark. I don't know that there are many books in the Bible with as clear and simple an outline as John. Essentially, John consists of 2 parts, and it's divided almost down the middle. Now, scholars have typically called these 2 books, so that's what I'll use to talk about them with. They're not literally 2 separate books, they're just like 2 sections or 2 segments of the gospel. The first one is what they have called the book of signs, and we'll talk in just a few minutes about why it's called the book of signs. The second is called the book of glory, and again we'll talk about what that specifically means. But notice that it's almost cutting the book in half. First 12 chapters, the book of signs, and the last, 9 chapters, 8-9 chapters, the book of glory. Not quite, but almost in half. It's amazing to think that by the end of chapter 12, we are speeding into the final hours of Jesus' life, and by the beginning of chapter 13, we are in the last night of Jesus' life. So this is, the book of John, the Gospel of John, is not a biography in any sense of the word. How can you have a true biography when it doesn't talk about the birth and the raising of whoever it is that you're dealing with? when it deals with the rest of that individual's life in about the same amount of space that it deals with the last hours of the person's life. Clearly, there is a profound and theological emphasis on what it means for Jesus to live so that He might die, and to die so that He might live, and to live so that we might live. That's really the focus of what's going on in this gospel. So 2 simple divisions, 2 simple books, the first being the book of signs. We're going to look mostly at the book of signs, though we'll spend a little bit of time in the book of glory. Now, why is it called the book of signs? In John's gospel, John doesn't use, like other gospel writers do, or like we would, the term miracles. When we talk, let's say, about the feeding of the 5,000, we'll talk about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, or the miracle of walking on the water, etc. John doesn't use that kind of terminology. John uses the terminology of signs. Signs. That this one whom he believes with all of his heart is the Messiah sent of God. This one has come so that we might believe. I'll say more about that in a moment. But he's not asking us to believe in a vacuum with no evidence. He is going to give us signs that will verify what he claims is true about himself. Now, in typical scriptural fashion, with 7 being the number of completeness, John has thoughtfully chosen 7 key signs in the life of Jesus that he will weave into his gospel account as being the key evidence that Jesus is the one sent of God. Those 7 signs are key. Now, there's another piece of this that I haven't even gotten into tonight, but that is also a very important part of John's gospel, and that weaves itself through some of the signs as well. And that is the I am statements of Jesus, of which there are 7 as well. So his gospel, for all its simplicity, is very carefully constructed. So what are the 7 signs? Well, you remember this one, the turning of the water to wine in Cana. It's one of the simple stories that we tell, and yet it's a very important story. I think the best title for a sermon, because, by the way, this whole gospel, and this sign in particular, has a lot to say about Jesus being the fulfillment of Judaism. That begins from the very outset of the book. Some even believe that John has structured his gospel after the pattern of a Jewish liturgical worship book, and that as he works through with the different ceremonies and symbols of Judaism, he is showing how Jesus is the fulfillment, the enrichment of each and every one of those. It starts right at the beginning where we talked about Jesus tabernacled among us, a very clear reference back to the Old Testament tabernacle. But it continues in the same fashion throughout the gospel. In this case, you remember that the stone pots, the water pots, in which the water became wine were for what purpose? For Jewish purification purposes. It's another statement about Judaism being enriched and transformed. If the purification provided by these rituals is good, imagine how much richer will be the purification that comes in Jesus Christ. That's the first sign. Second sign, the healing of the official's son. You'll remember that one. The healing at the pool of Bethesda, which we've already mentioned. The feeding of the 5,000, you'll remember from a few weeks ago, is the only miracle or sign that appears in all 4 Gospels. Clearly a very important one. Jesus walking on the water, we'll come back to that one in a bit. The healing of the man born blind, which becomes the subject of a discussion about God and guilt and human responsibility and freedom and forgiveness, and a very important passage. And then finally, the 7th sign, which we're going to say much more about, John 11, the resurrection of Lazarus. So those are the 7 signs in the book of signs. With the entire scope of Jesus' life and ministry vividly in mind, John selected primarily those incidents that mark turning points and crises. But in each instance, he shows notice this, greater interest in the significance of the event, as reflected each time by an accompanying discourse, than in the event itself. Remember, he uses the term signs. What is a sign? A sign is something that is pointing to something else. It is trying to direct you along the right path. It is trying to give you information that will get you to an important destination. In John's gospel, that's the role of what we usually call miracles. It's not so much the focus on the event itself as it is to say, this is what that sign is pointing toward. That's why the accompanying discourse becomes so important. It's almost as though he uses this to get your attention. And now that I have your attention, let me talk about what this means. What does this say about the mind of God, the heart of God? To finish off this quotation, like Matthew, though without duplication, John reports various discourses at considerable length. However, those reported by Matthew deal primarily with the kingdom of heaven and the character of its subjects, whereas those of John are concerned almost exclusively with Jesus' nature as the incarnate Son of God and with the purpose of his earthly mission. So if I could summarize that in my words, here's what I would say. If you want to study about the nature of the kingdom of God and how we as its citizens are to grow and mature and how our lives are to be characterized, Matthew is a great place to study that. If you want to know about the kingdom of God in terms of who God is, who Jesus is, and what happens in their mind, what their relationship is like, which then spills over into our relationship with them, start with John. They are both talking about that kingdom, but they are talking about different facets of it, different aspects of it. John's gospel is unique also in the sense that in John 20, he clearly states his purpose for writing it. Now, I decided to include this here rather than back when we were talking about uniqueness for this simple reason. At the end of the book, he's going to give us his specific purpose for writing the book. We don't always get that in Scripture. We don't always get somebody just saying, okay, here's the reason I'm writing. We get it in John's gospel, but remember that when we're going through the book of signs, the reason those signs are there are to help accomplish this purpose. So what is that purpose? In the TNIV, this section is given the heading, The Purpose of John's Gospel, and here's what it says. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. In other words, John is saying, don't think that just because I recorded these 7, these are the only ones. Far from it. I have carefully chosen these 7 for specific reasons. Performed many other signs, he says, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that. Now, those words right there tell you, here's a signal, here's a flag that tells you, here is why I have written this. It's wonderful because now we know the specific purpose of his gospel. But these are written that you may what? Believe. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and, second part of it, that by believing you may have life in his name. So if anyone asks you, what is the purpose of John's gospel? Why did he write it? The answer is very simple. He wrote it so that I might believe in Jesus and that in believing I might have life in his name. Because of that, his purpose in writing, you will find the words believe and life are key words in his gospel. That's not the only place it appears. Probably the verse that all of us know the best in John's gospel is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever what? Believeth in him shall not perish but have what? Exactly. There you have it. This is done so that you might believe, and belief happens so that you might have life. That's the whole purpose that he's written this. So the 7 signs are thoroughly building the case that Jesus is the Messiah. And then in the second half of his gospel, his action in his passion is that which provides us life. So if you were to ask me, how would you summarize those 2 books of signs? First one I might say believe, second one I might say life. That I might believe, and that in believing I might have life. The simplicity of John's gospel, and yet there is depth that we can study throughout our entire lives about those 2 realities, the belief in Jesus and the life that comes in his name. Now, this is somewhat arbitrary, and I understand that. But we can't go through all of this, and yet we need to go through some of it to get a sense of what is happening. So we're going to look at just 2 of those signs to give us somewhat of a feel for what Jesus is doing, what is happening in his life and ministry, and how John is using that material to move us in the direction of belief. So the first one, we're going to look at 2 of them, walking on the water, John 6, and the resurrection of Lazarus. So we begin with this, when Jesus walks on the water. Now, to set a context, let me just tell you where we are here. It happens between 2 key events. First of all, what happens immediately before it, the feeding of the 5,000, and then what happens immediately after it, his discourse on the bread of life. We've already talked a little bit about those 2. Right in between those 2 comes this incident. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. Now, right there, just that simple sentence, if you plumb that for some depth, you will know that you've been in that boat too. It's dark, and Jesus has not yet joined you. And you know exactly what that experience is like. And then add to it that a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. You're familiar with that story. There are 2 or 3 different incidents in the Gospels that have to do with Jesus and water. One of them we already talked about back in Mark. You remember when we talked about, quick parenthetical review so we're all on the same page, the meaning of water, chaos and darkness and evil, and all that would have brought into the disciples' hearts and minds and experience, helps underline why they would have been afraid. Add to that Jesus walking on the water, and may I again remind you of our conversation now 2-3 weeks ago, that again the imagery there is very strong in referring back to the very beginning of the biblical story rather, where God talks to Adam and Eve about stepping on the head of the serpent. It will bruise your heel, you will crush its head. And here comes Jesus with evil under his feet. So don't forget that imagery. But we want to go beyond that this evening with this imagery.
I hope you enjoyed Pastor Randy's presentation today, and you'll join us next week for part 2 and the conclusion of it. But right now we're going to share with you several mission stories. These are from some older stories that haven't been shown. We hope you'll really appreciate these special mission stories that show the work that's going on around the globe. And again, want to remind you that in a few weeks, we're going to be announcing what our very brand new special Sabbath School presentation is going to be right here on this broadcast. And once again, we appreciate you joining us each and every Sabbath.
Ferdinand spent 7 years sleeping under a tree near the Danube River in Vienna, Austria. He was homeless and hurting, but Ferdinand saw an opportunity to change his life, and he took it. In the center of the city, This ADRA-operated center of influence meets the needs of the homeless and refugee population.
Yes, this is a center of influence where we take the people from where they are with their needs, from the street, refugees, and we do integration work for the refugees. We give German courses, the language courses in general, and we help them with government issues, with papers and forms to get registered here. They get also food, they get clothes, and also be included in a social environment where they start to regain their self-esteem and become a part of our society.
Yeah, here you are in the room of our clothing distribution. We have this room open for 2 days per week, 1 day for women and children, 1 day for men. And they can come here, they can apply and get any clothing they need for their everyday life.
In addition to the clothing distribution, a major event of the week is the food distribution. People come to have a meal together, take food for their families, and have a place to feel safe. Ferdinand had little hope of improving his life. Each day he visited various social projects around Vienna that gave food to the homeless. Every day was the same, until one day he went to the center of influence run by ADRA. He thought that something was different about this place. In a city where everyone seemed too busy to notice him, Ferdinand felt genuinely welcomed in this center. Over time, he kept coming back, and the center felt more like home than anywhere else. He began volunteering at the center and had some ideas on how to improve their services. He was given responsibility and started a paid job. His life was totally transformed, and he developed a relationship with Jesus. Now, Ferdinand serves as a full-time project manager for the center, touching lives every single day. He understands the needs of the people and is a symbol of hope to others. The staff here shares a spiritual message to those who are open to learning more about Jesus. They offer a Bible study on Saturday afternoons to anyone who is interested. Their group is growing each week.
Well, compared to the traditional understanding of evangelism, where you confront people with the Bible straight away, here you have to win their relationship, their friendship, their trust first. That means you can't hit them with the Bible over their head, but you have to show and prove to them that they as people are important. And that takes a lot of patience. On the other hand, you need a vision. You need to know where you want to lead them and ask the Lord to show us the way how to do it.
Please pray for this center of influence in Vienna. Pray that they are able to meet the needs of the people in practical and spiritual ways. And pray that their actions continue to paint a picture of Jesus. Thank you for supporting Mission.
We are here in the city of Villejuif. This name means the city of Jews, Jewish city in French. And in fact, we are very close to Paris, in the suburb of Paris. Why we came here? Because this street and this city, and especially this building behind us, has a very strong and meaningful meaning for me, because it was where I was a child. My childhood was here in this street. And in fact, this synagogue was established by my father when I was a child.
Richard was born in Casablanca, Morocco, but it was a difficult country for a Jewish family to live at the time. They relocated to France when Richard was a young boy. His family bought a house in a suburb of Paris, but soon realized there was no Jewish synagogue nearby.
Because we had no synagogue in this city, my father, who was an Orthodox Jew, decided to plant a synagogue. And then he did it first as a home church, a home synagogue, we could say. This synagogue became the official synagogue of this city of Villejuif. And it was here where I have done my bar mitzvah when I was 12, exactly like Jesus in Jerusalem when he was 12. Okay, we are here in front of the school, my school when I was a child. And why this school has some importance for me? Because in fact it was my primary school, and it was in this school I met a friend who introduced me to his father. But his father was a Seventh-day Adventist. Not many Seventh-day Adventists in Villejuif at that time.
It was here that Richard was introduced to the Bible. He would go to his friend's house any chance he could to study the Bible over the next few years. With time, he started to feel a change in his outlook on life.
And then progressively, but it took me about 5 years, I discovered that Jesus was the Messiah of the Bible. And then I gave my life to Jesus. But it was very, very difficult for my family. I remember about 2 months before my baptism, my father called rabbis, many rabbis, to try to convince me not to convert to Adventism. But no argument can compete with what I understood from the Bible. And after this month, when my father discovered that I was decided to be baptized, he said, "You are not anymore my son." And he threw me out from the house. And then I have not seen my father for about 10 years.
There are millions of Jews around the world who have yet to be ministered to by Christians. Since the day he gave his life to Jesus, Richard has been passionate about sharing the gospel with the Jewish people. He became a pastor and lived in Israel for 15 years to study and pastor there. He eventually moved back to Paris to continue his work in reaching the Jewish people. Today, Richard leads a small Adventist Jewish congregation in Paris. This group meets regularly in a small space of what was once an old movie theater. The meetings are meant to bridge the gap between the Jewish faith and the Adventist faith, but they need your prayers.
You know, I have said I was born in a Jewish Orthodox family. And I know that the Jewish people is a people of God from the Bible. But something is missing among the Jews. And what is missing is a knowledge of Jesus. I have discovered Jesus 40 years ago. And since that time, I am in the church. And I try to share Jesus with the Jewish people because I know they need Jesus. I know the second coming of Jesus is very soon. But for that, he needs also the Jews to discover Jesus. And because I have experimented that in my life, I have experimented that the Jews need Jesus, we need to share Jesus with them. And because we want Jesus to come back soon, then we have to do the Jewish ministry. We have to preach the gospel to the Jews.
Please pray for this Adventist synagogue as they continue to grow. Thank you for your support of ministries like this.
On the Italian island of Sicily, customers who visit this hardware store get a lot more than tools. Located in the heart of the Mediterranean, Sicily is known for its natural beauty, friendly people, and fresh cuisine. The history of this Italian island dates back thousands of years, and the Apostle Paul landed on the island while being transported to Rome as a prisoner. In the city of Ragusa, Seventh-day Adventist Church members are actively working in their community. One member, Giorgio, owns a hardware store in town. He is grateful that God has blessed, and his business has grown over the years. A few years ago, Giorgio wanted to do more with the space in his building, so he created a classroom inside his store. He invited the church to use the room, and today the Ragusa Adventist Church uses this space to teach Italian language and culture courses to immigrants and refugees. During the week, they also give food to those who are in need. Local restaurants and bakeries donate food to the church to share with refugees and immigrants. The people who come are so thankful for the help they get from the Ragusa Church, and the members are happy that they are able to welcome people into Italian society. Uwe moved to Sicily from the country of Nigeria. He was forced to leave when a religious group threatened to kill his family if they did not take part in human sacrifices and other rituals. When he arrived in Italy with his family, he felt completely lost. Before long, Uwe started attending classes in Giorgio's store. The practical lessons have helped him so much. Since graduating from the class, he has made friends with the church members and feels confident enough to support his family. The message of his song translates to, "Even if we've never known each other before, you are my brother. It doesn't matter what color we are. We are all one." Small groups from the Ragusa Church meet regularly throughout the week to connect on a spiritual and practical level. This youth group gets together to catch up on each other's lives and study God's Word. This is the perfect atmosphere to invite friends to be a part of their church's activities. It's a time for them to ask questions, learn, and grow. On most Sabbaths, this Adventist church is full. All ages contribute to making this church whole. Unfortunately, some weeks the church is so full they have to turn people away. Because of the congregation's successful outreach, new members and guests sometimes find it hard to attend such a full church. Giorgio and other members worship God with all their hearts as their church family continues to grow. Please pray for the Ragusa church members as they reach out to their neighbors. Pray for the people they are meeting, thanks to the outreach of a room in a hardware store.
I like to preach. Through sermons, I feel I can lead souls to Christ, to His feet. To me, preaching is simply a part of me. It amazes me. My favorite passage is Psalms 91. There are some beautiful texts there. So before I prepare a topic, my dad and I select a chapter, and we pull the words of the Bible into sermons.
When Pablito was 6 years old, his father invited him to sing for a church program. Pablito had often seen his father sing and lead out, so they agreed on a music piece, and Pablito sang by himself in church for the first time.
Soy un corderito del Señor que va de la mano del pastor.
Sometime later, Pablito's father asked him if this time he would be willing to share a message with the congregation. Pablito's heart leaped in his chest. He had hoped for an opportunity to preach. Pablito was a bit shy, but his father told him that God would lead and use him. So they began selecting a theme for his first sermon. Now, years later, Pablito's example has encouraged other young men and women to preach and sing. These young preachers formed a group, and even today, they prepare together, study the Bible, and pray for each other. They want to be ready for God to use them as they tour churches of other denominations in Asunción, Paraguay.
One of the most important reasons for this work is to show people in other churches that young ones have a lot of potential. There are other churches that don't have an active youth, and we want young and old to see that children can preach, sing, and lead other activities in the worship service.
God has a special purpose for His children in reaching the minds and hearts of the people. We all need to be involved to make room for youth to develop and to encourage them in our mission to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth so Jesus can return soon.
Hi, my name is Alvin. It wasn't until I needed a miracle that I began searching for something new. I live in the small, beautiful country of Singapore. Tourists come here to view the Marina Bay Sands Hotel or the impressive skyline of the city, and a lot of powerful and successful men live and work in these skyscrapers. I would say that most Singaporeans are comfortable with their lives and feel secure about their future. In Singapore, we enjoy religious diversity and freedom, but many like me can't find the time or feel the need to deeply explore topics of a higher power. It wasn't until I needed a miracle that I began my search, and it happened when I discovered that I had terminal cancer. The doctors told me that I would not live long, months at best. So far, though, I've proven them wrong. I've fought this illness in many different ways, but the best treatment I have found is through a new start. N for nutrition, E for exercise, water, sleep, temperance, air, rest, and trust. New Start. This New Start program was offered in the Seventh-day Adventist Church Union office in Singapore. In the morning, we come for lectures to learn about natural resources that are readily available to strengthen our body's capacity for health. We regularly drink plenty of water and go out for exercise. A walk around the park provides fresh air, and a stretching session gets our blood flowing. It's important to also rest and do everything with temperance, or in proper measure, not too much, not too little. Nutrition is one of the vital components of this course. We learn to choose our food carefully and prepare tasty dishes. When we strengthen our body, it fights off disease for us, and we feel better and live longer. The last element, trust, is a completely new concept for me. It's a natural resource for health that is often emphasized here. Each time this comes up, I become more curious about God, our Creator. There are many important leaders attending this course. Some have traveled from other countries, and I feel privileged to be here. By improving my health, I've learned many important lessons, and I'm thankful for this wonderful program that gave me the tools to cultivate a healthy body, mind, and soul.